So you have decided to play a Dawnblade Warlock. That is a great choice in the current sandbox. Currently, Dawnblade is often considered to be the most powerful subclass amongst all the other subclasses. In this video, I hope to break down the subclass so that you understand how each part functions to help you with build crafting or with your general game knowledge. A disclaimer before we begin. Destiny is a game that constantly changes and evolves. As such, the information in this video may become less accurate the further in the future you are watching this. Therefore, I would always double check to ensure that the information presented is still accurate. Without further ado, let's get into the video. Before we get into the specifics of Dawnblade, I think it's important to get an overview of the Solar subclass in general. Solar is one of the three light subclasses, alongside Void and Arc. Solar in the current sandbox is incredibly potent. It contains everything that you would want in a PvE environment. It has two verbs which assist with healing, a verb that is a straight up damage buff, and it has damage over time and add clear verbs as well. Therefore, it is incredibly versatile and contains a lot of what you would need in any PvE scenario. The only tool that it does not have is a way to debuff enemies, but taking into account everything else, it's safe to say that this isn't much of a negative. Now that we have a rough overview on the Solar subclass, let's begin by defining the subclass verbs that is relevant for Solar. Firstly, let's talk about Restoration. Restoration has two tiers, Restoration X1 and Restoration X2. This buff will constantly heal your health as long as the buff is active. Restoration X1 heals for 35 HP per second, and Restoration X2 heals you for 50 HP per second. The duration of restoration can be affected by fragments, such as the Ember of Solace and the Ember of Empyrean. The next one to talk about is Cure. Cure also gives healing, similarly to Restoration. The only difference being is that Cure restores a big chunk of HP in one go, instead of giving health over time. Cure restores 60 HP per stack of Cure. However, keep in mind that after Cure activates, there is a 1 second cooldown where activating Cure again will not heal you. An example of this is Ember of Solace and Phoenix Dive. If your grenade kills an enemy while you have Ember of Solace and your Phoenix Dive activates less than a second after the grenade kill, you will not be able to receive the healing from Phoenix Dive as it is a cure. The final buff that Solar has is Radiant. Radiant is a buff that gives your weapons increased damage. You will get a 25% damage boost as long as Radiant is active. Not only that, being Radiant will also give weapons that do not have any champion counters the ability to stun barrier champions. The two verbs that you can apply to enemies that are linked to Solar is Scorch and Ignite. Let's talk about these together as they are related to each other, and Ignite relies on Scorch to activate. Enemies that are inflicted by Scorch takes damage over time. This damage lingers for 4.5 seconds and then starts decreasing at a rate of 5.67 stacks every 0.56 seconds until the enemy has no Scorch stacks remaining. If you manage to apply 100 stacks of Scorch on an enemy, they will ignite. Ignitions will create an explosion that deals 750 damage to any enemies within a 10-meter radius of the ignited enemy. This explosion has no damage falloff. Ignition damage can be increased if the Scorch damage that caused the ignition also has a damage increase. Any unstoppable champions that receives ignition damage will also be stunned. The class-specific pickup that the Solar subclass use is the Fire Sprite. Fire Sprites restore 12.5% grenade energy upon pickup. Allies are not able to pick up Fire Sprites that you generate, and they will last for around 25 seconds. There is a 5-second cooldown between generating Fire Sprites. Now that we have explained all the Solar verbs and pickups, let's continue by talking about the Solar grenades, as this is also shared by all the other Solar subclasses. Firebolt grenades shoots beams of solar energy at up to 4 enemies within an 8.5 meter radius on impact. It applies 20 Scorch stacks. It will deal 10 more Scorch stacks if you have the Embers of Ashes fragments. From now on, I will follow the format of saying 20 plus 10 Scorch stacks, with the former number being the amount of Scorch it applies without the fragment, and the latter number being how much more Scorch stacks the fragment adds on. It has a base cooldown of 64 seconds. Fusion grenades will stick on an enemy and then explode after a short time. The grenade has some tracking and will sometimes magnetize towards an enemy as well. It will apply 40 plus 20 Scorch stacks on detonation, and has a base cooldown of 73 seconds. Healing grenades will apply Cure X1 and Restoration X1 to anybody within the range of the grenade impact. If you or an ally is not within the grenade's impact radius, it will spawn a white glowing pickup that applies Restoration X1 if you go near it. It has a base cooldown of 91 seconds. Incendiary grenades will apply 60 plus 30 Scorch on detonation. The incendiary grenade will do more damage if it explodes underneath or nearby an enemy. It has a base cooldown of 105 seconds. Solar grenades create a scorching field on impact. It does 11 plus 10 Scorch on detonation, and then 9 plus 5 Scorch stacks for each second that an enemy stood inside of it. The base cooldown is 152 seconds. Swarm grenades creates 9 seeking drones on impact that will lock onto nearby enemies. Each drone does 5 plus 3 Scorch stacks on detonation. The base cooldown is 91 seconds. Thermite grenades creates 4 waves of fire, one after the other. Each wave of fire will apply 10 plus 10 stacks of Scorch. The base cooldown is 121 seconds. The final grenade is the Tripmine grenade. This will stick on a surface and then explode when an enemy is near. It applies 40 plus 20 stacks of Scorch on detonation, and it has a base cooldown of 121 seconds. Now that we have covered the grenades, let's talk about our melee abilities. For Dawnblade, we have 2 melees, Celestial Fire and Incinerator Snap. Celestial Fire emits 3 projectiles that can hit enemies over long range. Each projectile does 150 base damage, as well as apply 10 plus 5 Scorch on hit. The base cooldown of Celestial Fire is 112 seconds. Incinerator Snap releases 5 sparks that does 90 base damage per spark, and does 20 plus 10 Scorch stacks per spark. These sparks do not travel far and should therefore be used in closer range. The base cooldown of Incinerator Snap is 83 seconds. For our class abilities, Dawnblade has access to 3. You have your standard healing and empowering rifts, as well as a new class ability called Phoenix Dive. Healing Rift heals 40 HP per second. If you are at full HP, it will give you overshields at a rate of 3 HP per second, up to a maximum of 15 HP. The base cooldown of the Rift is 82 seconds. Your second class ability is Empowering Rift. This improves outgoing weapon damage by 20%. The base cooldown of Empowering Rift is the same as Healing Rift at 82 seconds. Both rifts last for 15 seconds, and you gain 20% damage resistance during the casting animation. The final class ability that Dawnblades have access to is Phoenix Dive. Instead of using your class ability button on the ground, Phoenix Dive must be activated in the air. This forces your character to dive to the ground, and upon hitting the ground, it will give you and any allies in 9 meters Cure X2. If Heat Rises is active, you will receive Restoration X2 for 3 seconds, as well as applying 40 plus 20 Scorch stacks and dealing 100 base damage to any enemies within 5 meters. It has a base cooldown of 55 seconds. The final ability that we would need to discuss would be the 2 Dawnblade supers, Daybreak and Well of Radiance. Let's talk about Daybreak. Daybreak creates a sword of fire that you may swing to create solar projectiles to scorch enemies in your path. The base duration of the super is 24 seconds, or 4.167% of your super per second. Each swing of the sword will consume 6.5% of your super, or reduce the base duration by 1.56 seconds. If you have the Icarus Dash aspect available, you can also use it during Daybreak, consuming 4.2% of your super, or 1 second from the base duration. Your Phoenix Dive will also deal 220 base damage while burning enemies in a 6 meter radius. This burning effect is different from Scorch. However, if Heat Rises is active, you will apply 60 plus 30 Scorch stacks on any nearby enemies. The base cooldown of Daybreak is 556 seconds. The final Dawnblade super that we need to learn about is Well of Radiance. Well of Radiance plants your sword into the ground. This creates a well that lasts for 30 seconds and confers 40% damage resistance, a 25% damage boost, healing at a rate of 100 HP per second, as well as Radiance anti-barrier properties. You are also immune to all stasis effects. The Well of Radiance has 800 HP and can be destroyed. Rank and file enemies as well as elite combatants deal 0.25 times damage to the well. Bosses and mini-bosses will do differing amounts of damage to the well based on the Warlock's resilience stat. At 0 resilience, they will do 1.25x damage, and with 100 resilience, they will do 0.25x damage. The base cooldown of Well of Radiance is 455 seconds. Alright, we have talked about all the abilities that are available to a Dawnblade. Let's talk about things that may add more abilities or modify existing abilities, which are aspects and fragments. I will cover the aspects first. Dawnblades have access to 3 aspects, each one giving you the ability to slot 2 fragments. You may freely choose 2 to use at any given time. These aspects are Touch of Flame, Icarus Dash, and Heat Rises. Let's begin with Touch of Flame. Touch of Flame will cause healing, solar, fusion, and firebolt grenades to have enhanced effects. Healing grenades will now offer Cure X2 and Restoration X2 for 4 seconds. Firebolt grenades now have a 12-meter radius and can seek up to 5 enemies. Solar grenades now last 2 seconds longer and emit magma orbs that do 50 base damage each. And lastly, fusion grenades will now have secondary explosion that deals 945 base damage. This secondary explosion does not apply additional scorch. Icarus Dash allows you to perform a horizontal dash that travels 8 meters with a 4-second cooldown. This distance is increased by 25% while in Daybreak. If you have Heat Rises active, it will give you a second charge of Icarus Dash, allowing you to dash twice in a row. However, it will increase your Icarus Dash cooldown to 5 seconds. Lastly, getting rapid airborne kills will allow you to get Cure X1. 3 rank and file enemies, 2 elites, or 1 boss will be able to grant you that cure. Finally, let's talk about Heat Rises. You will get 20 airborne efficiency and the ability to use your weapons and abilities while gliding passively. Getting kills while you are airborne will also grant you powered melee energy. The amount of energy each type of combatant will refund you will be displayed on the screen. To activate Heat Rises, you will need to hold your grenade button. This will consume your grenade to activate Heat Rises for 15 seconds. This will also release a burst of Cure X2 around you, healing you and any allies within 9 meters. Consuming a healing grenade will increase the cure stacks to X3, but consuming an enhanced healing grenade will grant you Restoration X1 for 4 seconds. While Heat Rises is active as well, you will gain an additional 50 airborne efficiency and a modified glide that will last indefinitely. Kills while Heat Rises is active will extend its duration. Tier 1 combatants will add 5 seconds, Tier 2 and 3 combatants will add 10 seconds, and Tier 4 combatants, mini-bosses, and bosses will add 15 seconds to the duration. Now we move on to the final part of this deep dive into Dawnblades, which are the fragments. Dawnblades share the same fragments with the other 2 solar subclasses, Sunbreakers and Gunslingers. If you already know what these fragments do by watching those subclass breakdowns, then you may feel free to skip this section. I will try to cover all these fragments concisely but still delivering the relevant details to you. I will also note any stat buffs or debuffs that the fragment may confer to you on the screen. Let's begin alphabetically with the Ember of Ashes. The Ember of Ashes allows you to apply 50% more Scorch to enemies, as denoted by all the times in this video where I have mentioned a plus when talking about how much Scorch stacks an ability applies. Note that some sources of Scorch do not follow this 50% buff, such as Caliban's Hand, Tommy's Matchbook, and Skyburner's Oath. The Ember of Beams causes solar super projectiles to home in on enemies. This only affects Daybreak projectiles for Dawnblades. The Ember of Benevolence causes applying Cure, Radiant, Restoration, Healing, or Reviving allies to grant 400% additional base grenade, melee, and class ability regeneration rate for 6 seconds. Note that Empowering Rifts and the Aeon Sect of Vigor's triggered healing will not cause the Ember of Benevolence to activate. The Ember of Blistering causes ignition kills to grant grenade ability energy based on enemy rank. Tier 1 combatants grant 8%, Tier 2 12.25%, Tier 3 6.5%, and Tier 4 combatants 25%. The Ember of Char applies 40 plus 20 Scorch to enemies damaged by the explosions from ignitions. This does not apply to the ignited enemy. The Ember of Combustion causes solar super kills to cause ignitions and spawn a fire sprite. The Well of Radiance causes all weapon damage to count as super ability damage for the caster. The Ember of Empyrean extends restoration and radiant effects by 4 seconds per kill. This duration cannot exceed 12 seconds. The Ember of Eruption causes your ignitions to have around a 20% increase in its explosion radius. The Ember of Mercy grants Restoration X1 for 2 seconds upon picking up a fire sprite. When you revive an ally, it will grant you and any allies nearby Restoration X1 for 5 seconds. The Ember of Resolve causes your grenade kills to grant Cure X1. The Ember of Searing allows killing scorched enemies to grant you powered melee energy based on enemy rank and spawns a fire sprite. Tier 1 combatants grant 8%, Tier 2 12.25%, Tier 3 16.5%, and Tier 4 combatants 25%. The Ember of Singeing will grant 300% additional base class ability regeneration rate for 3 seconds after applying Scorch to enemies. This will not affect if the enemy dies from the hit that would have applied the Scorch. The Ember of Solace causes restoration and radiant effects to last 50% longer. The Ember of Tempering allows solar weapon kills to grant plus 10 recovery for you and allies within 12.5 meters for 8 seconds. This can stack up to 3 times. While the Ember of Tempering is active, it grants plus 20 airborne effectiveness, and solar weapon kills spawn a fire sprite. The Ember of Torches causes powered melee hits to make you and allies within 8 meters radiant for 8 seconds. Lastly, the Ember of Wonder allows killing 2 enemies rapidly with ignitions to create an orb of power that grants 2.5% super energy. This will incur a 10-second cooldown upon creating an orb of power. Alright, this should pretty much cover everything that you would need to know about Dawnblades to get started build crafting or playing around with the subclass. Before I leave, however, I felt that it may be relevant to mention a specific tech unique to Dawnblades. Revenants have their own version of this tech, however their method varies ever so slightly. I'm talking about well skating. Well skating is a movement tech that sends Dawnblades flying at an incredibly high speed, useful for getting to a location fast or to clear large distances in one glide. I will not get into the more advanced tech such as incorporating heat rises or even ground well skates, but I felt that it may be useful to those watching if I explain how to perform a simple well skate. To perform this tech, you would need a sword with the perk Eager Edge. This would either be the half-truths or the other half from Dares of Eternity. To perform a well skate, position yourself at a ledge and ensure that you have Well of Radiance ready to cast. Switch to your Eager Edge sword to activate the perk. While the perk is active, heavy attack off the ledge, and then once your character is off or about to go off the ledge, press jump and super one after the other in quick succession. If done correctly, you will be sent flying. A great way to practice would be to load up a private Crucible match, set the game mode to Mayhem and select the Eternity map. Have the match timer be 30 minutes, super regeneration time 3 seconds. Once you are in the match, pick up heavy ammo and get practicing. You should be able to do this tech in around 1 or 2 hours of practice if not sooner. However, pulling it off in a real mission is a whole different story. Go slowly and practice and eventually you will be able to well skate at will. Alright, with that out of the way, the subclass breakdown has concluded. I will leave a link to the Destiny Data Compendium if you want to perform further research. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and enable notifications to ensure that you do not miss any of my uploads. This is the first episode of a series of 15 episodes covering every single subclass in Destiny. The next guide will be posted next Thursday and will be covering the Gunslinger. Thank you for watching and happy farming.